So the session, Defense in Depth. I will kind of slowly lead into the subject by providing a brief historic overview, talking a bit about key elements of network security and architectures, basic architectures, and then lead into some improvements and where I like things, where things should be going. And I must say there is a lot of work, I think, that we still have to do in the security space. And I like to talk a little bit about what's going on out there, what different groups and people are doing. So I will report a little bit from the trenches also, from the various standardization groups and working groups, and report to you the efforts that I see out there where I think things are kind of interesting and promising. And I hope that maybe you pick up on some of this stuff and maybe even get involved, get engaged in standardization efforts, because this is really what it's all about. We really need to come together to kind of build a better state, if you wish. I mean, this is critical, important. And towards the end, I will present to you a few use cases, which are actually should be pretty interesting to show you how all that stuff can be put into real life use and where it's already actually being used. And then so hopefully at the end we'll have some discussions, questions. If you can hold your questions towards the end, would be preferred. Then we can go any direction you like. I think there will be a lot that we probably want to talk about, hopefully. And I'll try to get to this presentation as quickly as possible. So, brief historic overview. The internet, of course, has emerged out of the evolution of two major areas of technology, right? Telecommunications and computing. It's all about communication. The rest is technology, I think, is a phrase that captures, and in essence, what is driving the evolution of the internet, right? The need for communication, exchange of data and information. What we have built historically, right, in terms of security, we have effectively modeled the brick and mortar world, right, in securing our networks by building, walls and fences around the networks, right, the so-called perimeter, right. So what we built, kind of these medieval fortified castles to protect the networks. So traditionally, networks have been secured as a whole, right, effectively encapsulating the network without any particular emphasis or focus on the endpoints, the users, the applications. Further characteristics here would be the internal security is typically very low, and external security is typically provided by numerous security point products, security point solutions that are deployed along the edges of the network, right? The classical perimeter approach. And the access devices, if they're protected at all, are typically protected by operating system style firewalls, right? Device firewalls, which are pretty much static in nature, right? And typically a secondary component in the form of software, right? Virus, malware detection software. So what's the problem with perimeter-based security? Well, first and foremost, it's a network-centric approach, right? The control is directional to and from rather than having a holistic policy. For remote access, for the most part, we deal with rather inflexible VPN access with no major granularity. And it's really designed for network edge security, right? That classical perimeter protection approach. We typically can't see all the communication, we can't see all the protocols that are passing through the perimeter, and it's a rather inflexible solution once it's installed. And it's really all based on the principle of integration of point products. So of course we know how the internet has evolved, or is kind of still evolving. It's no longer just enterprise networks that are connected to the internet, right? It's increasingly people working from home, right? Teleworkers, road warriors, working from wireless hotspots, internet cafes, all these numerous wireless and mobile devices that are floating out there, right? In their various shapes and forms and platforms. Cloud or a data center or cloud resources, right, that companies increasingly utilizing. And of course, the critical business relationships between companies and third parties, right, such as suppliers, vendors, partners, outsourcing, offshoring, and so forth. And of course, branch offices, right, that are being utilized and need to be secured. And there are increasingly new networks and devices that come onto the internet, right, such as smart homes, right, or POS systems from major retailers, and industrial control systems. And industrial control systems actually pose an interesting challenge all on their own. I'm going to talk a little bit more about industrial control systems in a few minutes here in my presentation. So particularly the need for communicating with the third parties, right, from a company perspective, typically requires companies to open up additional ports in the network, in the perimeter firewall. So historically, we have built this security by aggregating, right, this pool of security point products, security point solutions, and due to communication needs, as I pointed out, right, the firewall has many holes, right. So really, what we end up is with fragmented security based on security point products. So what do I mean by defense in depth? And I actually want to add breadth here, because I think ultimately we must go deeper and broader in our approach. So while the traditional security solutions, right, such as the network boundary technologies, for example, will certainly continue to play their critical role. All right, I mean, nobody is seriously suggesting that you throw out your perimeter firewall, right, or UTM firewall. We increasingly have to start responding to their limitations and really ensure that we recognize these limitations and respond to them. So the trend that is happening as a result of communication increasingly bypassing the perimeter, right, or communication more and more happening on the endpoints is best described by the term deperimeterization, right? So in a fully deperimeterized world, every endpoint has to be, or every networked component, right, has to be protected, requiring a combination of endpoint and data protection with the various technologies and components, right, such as encryption, inherently secure and open protocols, inherently secure endpoints, access level authentication, event-driven automatic incident management responses, and continuous monitoring and automation. So those are kind of the key architectural ingredients. So what we are really undergoing these days is a paradigm shift, right, from network protection to endpoint protection. I mean, we have kind of, this has been going on for a while, right, and we are kind of in the middle of this. And what this really requires is new and improved security architecture. So this will be one of the key points that I will emphasize here in my presentation. So from an architectural level, the perimeter-based architecture, right, looks like this wall divider, right, that divides these two network zones, inside, outside, or trust, untrust, however you want to call them. From a logical architectural perspective, right, it's described as the security point products are logically deployed vertically versus the communication is flowing horizontally, right, or serialized to the point products, and mostly handled in isolation from each other. In contrast to that, I would like to kind of introduce you to a somewhat modified security architecture that is, so what I refer to as intelligence control-based architecture. So you see here, you recognize two key elements. So there's at the bottom, there's the network physics, and then at the top, there is the access cloud, where you effectively find the endpoints and the users. So the network physics is characterized by this interconnection, right, with what I refer to the information bus. So what this actually does, it facilitates intelligent communication between the security point products. So and hopefully there's a security protocol, right, that can facilitate the exchange of security events, such in the form of security metadata, right. Another component that is central to this approach is a security policy, right, which orchestrates security events and which also directs the policy enforcement elements, such as policy decision points, policy enforcement points, which then actually create the linkage between the network physics and the access cloud. So I just want to put this up here early on in my presentation just to give you an idea where I'm heading with this. And if you can keep this architecture in mind while I'm walking through the presentation, it may make a few things a lot clearer. And I'm actually going to revisit this architecture towards the end to kind of wrap this up, and then hopefully it will you start to make a little bit more sense. So since the late 90s, early 2000s, right, when it kind of became clear that there are significant limitations in the perimeter-based approach, various think tanks have started thinking about what could we improve, and they came up with new improved principles of new security architectures. And I'd just like to briefly summarize the core principles that they came up with. So use open secure protocols to communicate among endpoints. So an example of that would be the most prevalent VPN protocols and used today, right? IPsec and SSL. Make all endpoints capable of maintaining their own security and their own security policies, right? So that central focus and emphasis on endpoint protection elements, such as hopefully dynamic managed client firewalls, of course, software for malware, virus detection, trusted platform module, mobile trust module, chips to ensure integrity, and of course, enforcement and monitoring to ensure endpoint health. From a communication entity level, organizations and individual users, right, must establish a trust system where they actually assign security responsibilities for the communication. And in that space, we have technologies such as access control, application identity, federated services, or federated security. By default, of course, all data must be secured, right, whether at rest, in transit, or in use. So here we have technologies such as virtual private networks and self-encrypted drives. And of course, all security mechanisms, right, must be pervasive, scalable, and easy to use. And the solutions must be applicable across all industry verticals. So we can really no longer afford to have security solutions that only work in particular industry verticals, right? And we have perfect examples of this, such as take SCAP, right? The Security and Content Automation Protocol, which is mainly used within the government, right? And so we must ensure that the frameworks, the solutions we come up with actually work across all industry verticals and, of course, across all endpoints and platforms. So a holistic security approach has to be approached across all networked endpoints from all vendors, right? And if I use the terminology endpoint, just a clarification here of the term endpoint, what I mean is any system or component that can be connected into a network, right? Such as servers, office equipment, right? Think of scanners, printers, faxes, desktops, mobile devices, industrial control systems, right? Think of SCADA devices, human-machine interfaces. Think of ATM machines, right? Industrial systems, smart cars, smart homes, right? I mean, those are all relevant discussions these days. And every network device has to become a secure and controlled endpoint. And once connected to the network, every endpoint has to be engaged in continuous automatic monitoring and control. This is a fundamental requirement. So key operations are monitoring and assessment. So gathering, analyzing, presenting security event information. Of course, this is necessary, but it is not sufficient. We also want to be able to react to security events, right? So we want to be able to execute decisions based on a centralized security policy. And in the next level, we also want to be able to communicate security events across organizations, right? So sharing and handling of incidents events is critical. And of course, all this should be as much automated as possible. So this is one of my key messages also, that we really require better and improved automation of frameworks. That is a very critical element and will be one of the core messages here in my presentation. Key standards are actually a problem today. So there are too many standards organizations. We quite frankly have too many standards bodies. And so here we often find rivalries in the standards organizations, fee arrangements that get in the way, and we quite frankly have too many standards. I mean, those are characterized by incompatibilities, overlap, and still, despite having all these standards, we still have significant gaps, by the way. And the other element that I will keep emphasizing here in my presentation is we have too few true security frameworks. So these are kind of the two key elements I like to kind of emphasize in my presentation: automation and security frameworks. Involvement of key stakeholders is another problem. In those standardization meetings, right, or standardization groups or work groups, I typically see the same suspects, right, the same big companies and increasingly government that is getting involved. But I think we are really lacking broad participation of key stakeholders in developing new and improved standards and frameworks. Right, so Standards bodies. I mean, you probably recognize most, if not all of them, right? Of course, MITRE is technically not really a standards organization, right? But they often act as one, right? You often find MITRE as the community facilitator or maintainer of certain standards. Well, I realize you can't probably read this picture, but I think this is a nice representation of how convoluted this area of standards and standards organizations really is. So what is the problem with security point products and security point solutions? Well, first and foremost, there's a lack of vendor interoperability and compatibility, right, which really inhibits integration. Then there's a lack of open standards, which pretty much leaves us with vendor-unique products. Then, of course, there's a lack of automation, right, which really means we are wasting costly and valuable human resources. And then there's a lack of adoption, which I really think is a result of all of the above. So before I go into the architectural discussion, I'd just like to briefly summarize the problem space in which we are operating here. So the attack landscape is getting increasingly sophisticated, right? Advanced persistent threats. Threats are getting stealthier in nature and much more targeted. Then in the most recent years, right, what we have seen is attacks on trust, using key and certificate-based attacks, as you probably know. And then the other problem is we have many security controls. We have a large number of security controls. That's not the problem. The problem is that they lack coordination functionality and interoperability. And then just a clarification on point product. So if I use the term point product, right, security point product, I don't mean this negative in any way. I mean, I really think we have quite a number of really good security point products, from different vendors. I mean, I'm often kind of very excited to see some of those, but the problem really is that they work most in isolation from each other, right? That's silo security, and then we have many standards bodies. Here we find a mix of technical and political issues. And the security offense and defenses are often not orchestrated, right? Which I think is a direct result of silo security. And then we have too much manual intervention, right? Lack of automation, and also there's too much consumerization, right? That vendors really focus. We see this particular in the mobile device space, right? Vendors focusing on gadgets, consumer functions, rather than emphasizing features and functions that enterprises require to operate and secure their networks, right? I mean, case in point, Android, right? Take Android. How long did it take for Android until we got a really functional IPsec VPN and API in Android, right? It wasn't until Android 4.0. I mean, this should have been there from the inception. Then vendors develop for different target verticals, right? Or solutions are developed within certain verticals and then largely remain in these verticals, typically, right? I already mentioned SCAP as an example. Developed within the government, mainly remains within the government. And inconsistent terminology is interesting enough, also often a problem. So why should you care? Well, so security is not just security in the technical sense as we know it, right, as security practitioners, confidentiality, integrity, authenticity. But I mean, the equation, of course, is much longer, right? There is simplicity. If it's too complex, things will break. Interoperability. If it's not interoperable, things will break. Cost effectiveness. If it's not cost effective, right, I mean, forget it. And we want to recognize security by recognized industry standards. Software-defined networks and virtualization, right? I'm just mentioning these two technologies because they are really in broad deployment and these days industry-wide. And there are a lot of security issues in these technologies, and we're kind of addressing them while we move along, right? So this leads me to the secure by design element, right? So security has to be designed into the core of the product. Otherwise, it's just a retrofitting effort, and we are bolting on security to existing technology, which is never good. So what I really would see is sort of a logo maybe that kind of illustrates, right, a certain level of security to potential buyers or to decision makers, right, that make purchasing decisions for security products and security technologies. And I'll just point out that the Wi-Fi Alliance here, which, and that's not really for security, but just to give you an example of an industry alliance that I think got it right I mean, they really came up with something that, somebody that purchases a product can actually identify, well, this has certain functionality and certain features. So this is kind of what I'm after really in the security space. And actually, interesting enough, I mean, it addresses some of the parameters in that equation up there, right? Simplicity, interoperability. So I mean, this is something what I would be looking for ideally. Cost off the shelf products, right, is a big discussion in government these days, right? Sourcing a $5,000 off the shelf product rather than developing your own $50,000, $500,000 or $5 million solution as it often goes, right? And cost of major system compromises, is on the rise year over year. I mean, I just heard last week on Bloomberg, the aggregated damage, right, to the economy is somewhere in the range of 100 billion, and system compromises are also directly contributed to job losses. So, that's a big economic deal. Compliance directives, are increasing number and complexity, and they're not going to go away anytime soon. And then critical infrastructure protection, right? Industrial control systems. I already mentioned those briefly. Think of a production line, right, where an analog component is controlled by a digital component, right? Also referred to as a programmable logic controller, a PLC, right? Another component of this control chain typically is an operator panel, right? The human machine interface, HMI, which sits remotely somewhere from the process that you're trying to control. Now, a protocol that runs over the HMI, a legacy protocol, right, is Modbus. One of the problems with Modbus and many other protocols in that space for that matter is they were designed with absolutely no security, right? Particularly, main problem, no authentication. So you really have no way of knowing if the person that actually operates that device, right, sends commands or retrieves commands, is really authorized to do so, right? Of course, these protocols were developed to operate over serial connections, right, where this wasn't really an issue, right? But now they are increasingly ported to TCP, and effectively, if you can ping the system, you can issue commands to it, right? That is kind of the state of the art in industrial control systems. And as these systems are connected to enterprise networks and to the internet, we typically deal with the very same issues here that we have dealt with enterprise systems in the past couple of years. And last not least, adoption. So every now and then, we have technology where we think, wow, this is great. This is something that really everybody most certainly wants, right? And you would expect that the adoption is just taking off like a rocket, right? Everybody just should deploy this, and then you just wonder, why the adoption really isn't there. So case in point, SIEM, right? Security, Information and Event Management. And this technology, I think, is actually doing all the right things, right? It's actually really a good technology, right? It's targeted at enhancing IT security, addressing cost of compliance, helping with managing of overall risk management processes, right? So by doing all the right features and functions, right? I mean, aggregating, collecting security events and log information, right, from all these different security point products, right? Your firewalls, gateways, switches, routers, VPN gateways, leak prevention systems, and so forth, really providing this higher level of aggregation, right? And then helping with compliance and helping with identifying threats and respond to threats and helping with risk management processes. So it's doing all the right things. So why is the adoption not really there where we would expect it to be? And I have a few thoughts on this, why that is. So first and foremost, the term was actually created by an analyst firm versus a vendor-supported standards group. Then it describes really a product technology, right, versus a solution. And of course, vendors do what vendors do, right? If you leave technology up to the vendor to interpret, right, vendors implement what they interpret, right? And of course, then there's the inevitable vendor bloat. So every vendor thinks, of course, that their system is somewhat unique, somewhat special, and does things that nobody else does, right? And then you end up with a system that is really complex, and it's difficult to implement, to deploy, and to manage. And then this is the report card, by the way. So according to one of the latest reports from Infotech Research Group, the realized impact of SIEM appears to be trailing the expected impact. So let's shift gears now and talk architecture. So I think it's really a mistake to assume that you aggregate a number of security point products, you put them together, right, and then kind of a framework will evolve out of this. I think that's what we have done historically, but this is not working, right? What we really need to do is develop very good, robust security frameworks and then make sure that the security point products and solutions really integrate into this framework. And I think this intuitively makes sense, right? I mean, taking kind of an example from the brick and mortar world again, right? I mean, obviously you're not building a house by building the gourmet kitchen first, the master bathroom, the master bedroom, right? And then at the end you frame the house. I mean, that's obviously not how you do it. So likewise, here in the IT space, we should take a similar approach. So the vendor-neutral interoperable base should be the basis for this framework. And reason being, as I already mentioned, right, the security point products are typically found, or good, the best of breed security point products are found across different vendors, right? So you want to be able to pick and choose security point products from various vendors as they fit into their architecture. And then overarching, you have the control framework. Key elements of this architecture are essentially trust control, continuous assessment, real-time response, policy decision, policy enforcement, access control, continuous monitoring, endpoint control, and of course centralized automation. So I'm going to talk about these key elements here in my presentation. So let's start with access control. Access control, in my mind, has two high-level elements. So there's the event before the endpoint is joining the network, right? So this is what I refer to as pre-access control. Pre-access control really has two elements. Physical access control, right? Think of a person swiping an access card in a card reader, right? And logical access control, which typically deals with authentication, right? Establishing the user and or device identity. Location, could be a combination actually. Could be a person swiping an access card, getting access into a room, and then logging on a terminal, and hopefully you can combine all these access control elements in a logical access decision by provisioning the firewall rules or access control lists. So once the endpoint is on the network, it doesn't stop there. There is this element of what I refer to as post-access control. So post-access control has two elements: event-based control, which really deals with events that are happening on the endpoint, and behavioral control, which is basically targeted at the user. And behavioral control actually is very relevant in various industry verticals, such as the finance or the healthcare, right? Let me give you a healthcare example. A nurse, right, working in a hospital, accessing patient records from a nursing station every day, and then one day that nurse accesses patient records from the ER, right? That's a behavioral change that should be detected and properly addressed. So most people, if they actually think about access control, think about a pre-access control, don't think that much about a post-access control. So pre-access control really establishes the level of privacy and information access. And here we deal with typically two frameworks: the authentication framework, which establishes the identity, and the authorization framework, which then deals with mainly with the provisioning aspect, right, in the form of firewall rules and access control lists. Now, one of the big problems in managing large networks is the complexity of security administration, right? Role-based access has pretty much become the predominant model for advanced access control. Large IT firms such as IBM, Siemens, Secure Computing, Sybase, right, have started developing products around role-based access control since about the mid-90s. In 2000, a unified model for role-based access control was actually presented by NIST as the NIST ARBAC model, which later was adopted as an ANSI standard in 2004. Now, there were two main areas where role-based access control has been heavily criticized. So one was the problematic or the difficulty in establishing the initial role structure, and the second one was really to its inflexibility to sufficiently support dynamic attributes such as time of day, right, which you may want to use in an access control decision. So the thought here right now is, or presently what many people think is enhancing or maybe even replacing role-based access control altogether with a more rule-based approach, which is provided by attribute-based access control. ABAC offers an attribute identity binding. There's no clear consensus model today for ABAC, but it actually nicely allows you to model those real-life situations, right, that we are dealing with in today's access control scenarios, such as a bank teller working 9 to 5, or a book subject is a bookkeeper working 9 to 5 and also has management authorization. It offers greater flexibility over role-based access control because it doesn't require separate roles, right, for various dynamic attributes, and it's much easier and quicker to implement to accommodate these fast, rapidly changing business needs, right? There's a trade-off here between flexibility and complexity because, on the one hand, it's easy to deploy and roll out, but on the other hand, as you can appreciate, right, due to all the dynamic situations that we can address now, it can actually get complex to manage pretty quickly. An attribute-based access control, a matrix, right, probably would look like this. So you're actually, what you're doing is you're assessing security elements from various entities. So you would have, for example, requesting entity, requesting device, entity location, certified site type, right? You actually combine those and you attach a certain level of privacy to that communication. For enforcement, there is a certain kind of enforcement mechanism, right? So I've kind of constructed here an enforcement engine. So what you're really trying to do here is connect a data consumer to a data provider, right? So you have an accessing entity such as a citizen, patient, organization, company, or government agency, right? Then you have different control planes. So in this example, I just have chosen 3 control planes. I mean, could be more, could be less, but in this example, I just have 3. So my 3 control planes here are authentication, device attributes, network attributes. So for example, authentication, right? An unauthenticated user or device, right, would maybe have a security level of 1, and let's say a government employee, right, with a common access card or a PIV card would have a security level of 6. Then in the device attributes, an unauthenticated device would have a security level of 1, and the highest level maybe would be a company-issued device, right, that is secured with a TPM chip and self-encrypted drive, right? So that would maybe have a security level of 6. And then in the network attributes column there, right, we would have, for example, an open access point would have a security level of 1, and the highest level of security would be attached to maybe a high secured access, such as a port maybe that is in a room where you need to swipe an access card at an access card reader, get access into the room. You have to plug in the wire into that port, and then that port is also secured by 802.1x, for example, right? So that maybe would get a security level of 6. So you would assign all these different levels of security, and then you would arrive at an valid or invalid path for enforcement purposes, depending on what kind of resource that entity is trying to access. So combining a role-based and attribute-based access control obviously, right, offers a stronger and more granular level of control. So in that sense, access control is great, right? But of course, a big question is, who do you trust, right? So the measures of effective trust control are essentially establishing a strong identity, right, which is addressed in the realm of trusted identity, and verifying endpoint health, which is addressed within the realm of trusted computing. So a trusted identity should consist of a multi-layered identity strategy, right, to establish a really strong relationship, a really strong trust relationship. Keep in mind that improper trust relationships today create by far the most security issues in networks. I just provided you a few examples, and I'm sure you're recognizing all of them. I also provided the relevant CAPEC classification here to each of them. Just for those of you who don't know what CAPEC is the Common Attack Pattern Enumeration Classification, a classification framework that is sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security as part of their Strategic Software Assurance Initiative. So there's a lot of stuff that's actually coming out of the government these days. So today the awareness that software cannot be trusted is pretty much pervasive, right? I mean, applications are vulnerable to coding defects, parsing errors, buffer overflows, right? Think of the infamous OWASP top 10 list for web applications, right? Systems are vulnerable, unconfigured, unpatched, right? Despite all these patching treadmills that people and companies are going through. So the fundamental requirement really here is the trust control must assess and measure the state of the endpoint. So that is a very critical requirement that we have to examine further, and where we have some work to do. Also keep in mind that trust has to go both ways. It's not just I'm trusting, the network is only trusting the device that is coming in, but likewise, the device should only, or the endpoint, should only trust incoming unsolicited communication by user action or policy. Also very important to keep in mind. Then a big question, of course, is, well, okay, so where do I anchor my integrity assertions, right? So here we have the critical element of root of trust in the form of TPM chips, MTM, and self-encrypted drives. And then the infrastructure, of course, that is built of those various components, right, has ultimately to rely on the trustworthiness of the component that make up the infrastructure, right? So here we have elements such as trusted applications, network access control, integrity reports, and so forth. And of course, what that means also is that at the base level, there is a need for asset identification, for inventory and assessment. And I actually want to use asset identification as an example here to illustrate my point that I made earlier on standards, right? That there's a large number of standards characterized by overlap, incompatibilities, and we still have significant gaps actually. So I'm not going to go into detail in all of these, but I just want to kind of mention the most commonly used ones in that space, and to kind of illustrate to you, this very point. And it really all depends how you approach a certain subject, right? What kind of a solution you are aiming for, and what are you trying to do, right? For example, in the asset identification space, what am I aiming at? Do I want integrity, the identification by integrity or device class, or what kind of an identification do I want to achieve? So here we go. Asset identification, part of SCAP, UUIDs, SWIT tags, URIs, OIDs, DOIDs, common platform enumeration, also part of SCAP again. So there are actually multiple standards within SCAP that kind of trying to accomplish a similar thing, but with kind of slightly different focus, right? So I hope you get the idea. Endpoint control has mainly two elements, right? The vulnerability control is trying to assess vulnerabilities, right? Errors, flaws, or mistakes in computer software, and then configuration control, of course, which tries to assess misconfigurations that can lead to adverse effects. Of course, controlling these elements, right? Detecting and presenting and analyzing all this is great and is critical. But ultimately, what you want to assure is, you want to establish that the level of endpoint, right? What endpoint am I talking to? Am I actually talking to the right endpoint? Which is a very, very critical question, and we're going to get to that. Within the realm of endpoint control, there is the probably most relevant piece of standard is endpoint posture RFC from the IETF Network Endpoint and Assessment Workgroup, which deals with the collection transport of endpoint assessment data. The fundamental requirement for this piece of standard actually is that the endpoint needs to be trusted, right, to accurately represent the security posture of the endpoint. Per NIA charter, the NIA reference model does actually not specify how to detect or prevent lying endpoints. Also, it doesn't deal with detection of malware, such as rootkits, for example, right, that could trick posture collectors into reporting inaccurate or false endpoint information. That's actually a big deal. So this work currently is referred to work outside of the IETF to other organizations, such as the Trusted Computing Group, for example. So two open issues that I like to kind of leave you with here in that space. So one is, we need a standard for asserting endpoint identity and state, and there's actually currently a sub-work group as part of the Trusted Network Connect work group within the TCG, the Trusted Computing Group, which deals with developing a device identity and state framework. So what we're really trying to do here is how to ensure I'm talking to the right endpoint, right? What parameters can I use reliably to establish device identity and state, right? Hardware, software, network elements, a combination of all those. So if I'm installing software on an endpoint, right, additional software, or if I make minor configuration changes, am I still talking to the right endpoint? Is that still the same endpoint? So identifying changes in endpoint posture, right? Big deal. Another problem we probably want to solve somewhere down the road is dynamic name distribution and maintenance of names, where we have all these different ways of encoding and presenting names, right, and storing them in all kinds of different authoritative sources, right, such as LDAP, right? Think of Active Directory, SQL databases, CMDBs, network scanners, and so forth. But there's really no unified namespace, which also is actually a big problem if we really want to have a unified management approach. So obviously what we want to do is capturing events in as close as real time as possible, right? I mean, one may argue what real time really is, right? Of course, there are good scientific discussions about that. But bottom line is you want to improve operators' ability, right, to, for one, react to security events in a timely manner, and also to prioritize security events in a timely manner, right? This is obviously critical. This should be, as already explained, a policy-driven approach that can verify endpoint configurations against a policy server policy. Of course, what that means for a universal policy requires a standardized language, right? And there's the requirement for a consistent interpretation. Moving up the value chain, right? It's, of course, again, it's good, right, to collect, analyze, and present, but of course, also we want to be able to respond to threats in a timely manner, and for that, of course, we want to make this automated. So automated threat response is a big deal, and for that, the events must be actionable, right? But in order to get there, we must ensure that the events can be inputted into our automation systems, right? And for that, the events, of course, must be machine consumable. Another big requirement. From a business standpoint, right, of course, we must kind of keep an eye on business requirements, right? Otherwise, we're probably going to go nowhere. So the business side really is looking at supporting IT security, compliance verification, and audits, right? This effectively requires a high-level event model that maps to almost any event, and we need richer syntax and semantics to express complex interactions, right? I mean, the traditional syslog style timestamp host is really insufficient for that. We need event categories to answer compliance and audit style questions, and of course, we need to communicate across organizational environments, so a federation, right? And here we need to answer the critical question, what am I sharing with whom? And in that space, there's actually a new set of standards out of the US government that I thought I mentioned briefly here in my presentation, because it's still pretty new and probably not widely known to a lot of folks, sticks and taxis. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those a little bit later here in my presentation. Automation, of course, is freeing up human resources, right? We all want to do much more intelligent work than just staring at logs and doing kind of manual labor. And effective automation, of course, must rely on asset management, right? I already touched on that. Process management, we need the power processes to support all this, and event management, right? Event management is critically important. And as I said, right, automation, automated event management really forms ultimately the basis for the next higher level, right, in the value chain, which is automated threat response, right? So we obviously want to be able to respond to threats. Of course, automated threat response is vital to security, and then in the next higher up in the value chain, right, is remediation. Then we want to support automated remediation to ultimately support the secure endpoint connections, right? We just don't want to only have a binary approach, right, by accept or reject. We want to ensure that we can remediate and keep those endpoints secure on the network. In the remediation space, there are two main somewhat standards. Well, they both come in the form of NIST interagency reports, enterprise remediation, common remediation, enumeration, and but bottom line is that there is still a lot of work that we need to do in the automated remediation space. Challenges of automation frameworks in general are enable interoperable data exchanges, right, through standardized interfaces and protocols. Then we must define expressions for particular domain concepts, right? So we are operating across different domains, right? Think of data and storage domain, where you deal with different data formats. Then you have the automation content that's residing in different content repositories, right? And we want to be able to support curation and exchange of that security automation content. And of course, we want to support the exchange of security event information across organizational boundaries, right, which is critically important. Real-time response, already briefly touched on this, right? So there are mainly two timing events, the time of network attachment, and once the endpoint is on the network, there's a certain event trigger that triggers an action. Actions are typically accept, reject, or connect, disconnect, and then of course the higher value one, which is the remediation process, which typically goes through a quarantine operation. So now I want to talk about the various working groups and standardization organizations and report a little bit what kind of work is going on in these groups and in these organizations, and where I see work that I feel is interesting and promising and maybe even worthwhile for you if you don't know it to follow. And I also would like to encourage you to get engaged in some of these efforts. So maybe join a standardization organization or join these work groups. So there's the trusted computing group that I already mentioned a couple of times, an organization that started out with the goal of defining, promoting, developing vendor-neutral, interoperable industry standards. They're dealing mainly with these three elements these days: root of trust, trusted platform module, TPM chips, self-encrypted drive technology. Trusted Network Connect is a new security framework out of that group, and then the interface familiar data access point, IFMAP, security protocol in the TNC architecture. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about these, particularly the TNC architecture and IFMAP. Then in the ITF, there is actually a new work group that just got chartered about 2 weeks ago. They were above for many years and finally achieved charter. Security automation and continuous monitoring. And they're trying to define security automation protocols and data format standards to automate routine tasks. So that also will be a very relevant and very interesting effort. Then, of course, there's SCAP, the big gorilla, out of NIST. I already mentioned security and content automation protocol a couple of times. A very heavyweight government standard, has a bunch of other standards, above it or below it. It's built of all these various standards. And some of them are maybe actually quite usable for other efforts, such as the asset identification, for example. Then in the event management space, it kind of is a little bit sparse, unfortunately. So the only really relevant effort that I think looked pretty promising so far was actually EMAP, the Event Management Automation Protocol coming out of NIST. Unfortunately, EMAP is using CEE, Common Event Expression, as the log event standard. And the US government just withdrew funding for CEE most recently to apparently focus on other kind of efforts. And so I'm not quite sure how this will actually affect EMAP. But of course, as I mentioned, right, event management is critically important for threat response. So I think this is really a very relevant, very important effort that we have to keep going. Then a lot of work in form of standards and also a participation is actually out of the US government. So there in particular, we have the Department of Homeland Security, right? And there's the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, which is within the National Protection and Programs Directorate, which is responsible for enhancing the security, resiliency, and reliability of the nation's cyber and communication infrastructure. So they're effectively tasked to mitigate or even prevent interruptions to critical information infrastructure. And so one of the most recent efforts out of that office really are Sticks and Taxi, which I'll just very briefly introduce to you in a few minutes. So it's just for those of you who don't know, where all that is kind of located. So within the US government, of course, there's the US Department of Homeland Security, and in the DHS, there's the National Protection and Programs Directorate. So if we zoom into that, there's the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications in the NPPD. So just so you have seen that once. Another group that should not, of course, left or remain unnamed is the public-private partnerships, which is a very relevant group which does a lot of good work and also very worthwhile following. And this effort is pretty much spearheaded by SANS. I mean, SANS is just doing an absolute fabulous job in that space, and I'm pretty sure everybody knows who SANS is. Is there anybody in the audience that does not know who SANS is? Right, so SANS, an organization obviously established in 1989 as a cooperative research and education organization, right? And they're working closely together with government organizations and government entities and to really come up with security frameworks and building a kind of security consensus and security information. For example, the 20 critical controls is one of these efforts that came out of a strategic paper from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where effectively employees from security experts from government agencies pulled together their knowledge and their experience from attacks against government agencies to prioritize, among all the security controls we have, the top 20 controls that are most effective and can be demonstrated to prevent or at least mitigate critical attacks on government agencies and the national defense space. What was interesting here is with these 20 critical controls, when they tested those critical controls against financial institutions, what they found out was that these 20 critical controls are effectively identical across government agencies, industrial defense space, financial institutions, and retailers. So as you may or may not know, the retailer sector is another big area that is heavily targeted by cyber attacks. So the 20 critical controls hosted by SANS, you look those up on the SANS website. Certainly worthwhile reading them if you're not familiar with them. Another kind of consensus list that came out of as a result of leveraging that experience from the 20 critical controls and as a result of a partnership between SANS and MITRE is the top 25 most dangerous software errors. So it's another kind of interesting read and consensus list. So you find all of those at the SANS website, and a complete list of all these efforts can be found at measurablesecurity.mitre.org. So I provided the URL there for you. So just briefly, STIX and TAXI, for those of you who don't know it yet, structured threat information expression, collaborative community-driven effort. MITRE here is acting as the community facilitator presently. STIX is really a standardized language to represent cyber threat information in a structured way. The STIX is meant to be fully expressible, flexible, extensible, automatable, and as human-readable as possible. So for those of you who actually know IODEF, right, per RC 5070 Incident Object Definition Exchange format, right, are probably wondering now what STIX is trying to do. So STIX is trying to do a little bit more, is trying to be a little bit more up to date and a little bit richer than IODEF. And you can actually embed IODEF messages in STIX messages. So there is actually consideration for interoperability. So this is how typically a STIX message looks like. So it's very automatable, but also meant to be very human readable. Trusted automated exchange of indicator information. TAXI, again, also a collaborative community-driven effort. The transport mechanism for STIX, and it's really meant to provide this support for organizations to share cyber threat information in a secure and automated manner. So trusted computing, just a few words on trusted computing, typically involves these four key areas, right? Protected capabilities, integrity measurement and storage, integrity reporting, and attestation. And the Trusted Computing Group is very active. It's probably one of the most active work groups in that space around standardization. For those of you who kind of only heard about TPM chips and are really not sure what they're really good for, just a very, very basic example. You can use a TPM chip, for example, to create a hash over a system image. And with that, you can effectively validate that system image has not been tampered with. So very good, for example, to prevent boot viruses, right? Just as an example. But I really want to focus on the architecture. So Trusted Network Connect, I already mentioned that. Trusted Network Connect is a framework out of the Trusted Computing Group. It provides a standard interface for network authentication, also measurement for authentication. So what the TNC framework is trying to do is it tries to address some of the security issues that I've been pointing out in my presentation, such as silo security, right? The security point products only work in isolation from each other. Or also you're providing a manual and an automated event response, right? So really freeing up humans from really looking at security events and operating manually, right? Which of course is characterized by that threats are only detected, with large delays or, not detected at all. So this is really where Trusted Network Connect and the IFMAP protocol come into play. So IFMAP actually enables security point products to intelligently communicate with each other and exchange security event information in the form of security metadata. So now I'm going to go back to that architecture that I presented to you very early on in my presentation, right? That control-based intelligence architecture, where I had this information bus where I said, hopefully there's a protocol that facilitates that communication. So IFMAP is such a protocol that can really, do this, that can provide for intelligent communication between security point products and allows them to exchange security events. So in the TNC IFMAP world, there is the notion of the metadata access point database, which serves as the repository for the security metadata. So what IFMAP effectively allows you to do is it actually empowers the security point products to intelligently communicate with each other and sharing security event information in the form of security metadata. So in that sense, IFMAP creates that vendor neutral communication layer right on top of the vendor security functionality. The Trusted Network Connect framework from the Trusted Computing Group is really a vendor neutral interoperable security framework. So this is kind of a base architecture of the TNC architecture. So you just have seen this once. There are three key elements that basically establish the TNC architecture, which is the access requester, policy enforcement point, policy decision point. As you see, it resembles a client-server architecture, right, where the TNC client communicates with the TNC server. And you have on the access requester, which obviously is the endpoint, right, the access device. You have integrity measurement collectors, which collect certain security information on the endpoint. And those can be validated via the platform trust services module, which can use a TPM chip to validate the integrity of these measurements. As you recall, in the endpoint posture RFC, one of the big problems really was lying endpoints, right? So how do you ensure that these measurements have integrity? Then on the network level, the network access authority on the policy decision point communicates via the IFPAP interface with the policy enforcement point, and the policy enforcement point communicates with the network access requester on the endpoint for enforcement purposes. So the benefits of all this, of course, is that for one, it's cost effective, right? So it's also vendor neutral, right? So you can actually, a vendor implement that. It certainly operates across all vendors, and also it provides an automated approach, right? So it really saves a lot of human resources to analyze this. It provides for federated security. We just demonstrated actually on the latest Plugfest an NCP VPN solution, for example, that interoperates with a Juniper gateway, that instructs a Juniper firewall via a UAC to actually dynamically change firewall rules on the fly. It fits nicely of course, in the defense in depth strategy, right, through multi-level threat response. And another interesting aspect of IFMAP is that you can utilize IFMAP to integrate various security functionalities and protocols, so that you can actually now integrate everything into one architecture. And I'm going to show you a few examples of this. So you may recall this access control engine that I presented to you in the attribute-based access control space. So, and at the top you see the somewhat enhanced TNC architecture here with access requester, policy enforcement point, policy decision point, metadata access point, of course, and then optional sensors and flow controllers that can feed security metadata into the map for enforcement purposes. So at the bottom there, you see the attribute-based access control engine that collects certain access control information from the endpoint, analyzes this in its various control planes, and every analyzed event could then be fed as security metadata into the map, and also, of course, the end result, right, that this engine comes up with could be fed into the metadata access point as a security metadata, which then can be used in the PDP for further enforcement purposes on the endpoint. So this is just text I'm going to show you here in this animated presentation. So here I have an example of IFMAP in the space of a VPN technology. So here we have an IPsec VPN client. We have a VPN gateway. Then in the network, we have a file server, an intrusion detection system, and of course, the IFMAP server. So the VPN client establishes an IPsec VPN tunnel, and the user performs certain operations in the network that, let's say, are in compliance with the security policy. So after some time, the user may perform certain operations that are in violation of security policy. So if these operations are not detected by the perimeter point products, eventually they will be picked up by, for example, a leak prevention system, right? So the intrusion detection system will pick up a security event and will then publish a security event to the IFMAP server. So now the VPN gateway is subscribed with the map server, and it subscribes to events, security events that are related to its VPN clients. So through that subscription, the VPN gateway will become aware of this violation and can now analyze that security event and can perform actions accordingly. So for example, the VPN gateway could instruct the upstream policy enforcement point, such as the Juniper firewall, to reconfigure its firewall rules, right, via USC, for example, or move that client into a different VLAN, or the VPN gateway also could take matters in its own hand and could just say, okay, this is a critical breach, I'm just go ahead and disconnect that client. So in this example, of course, you see that the elements of policy enforcement point, policy decision point could be either distributed across various security point products, or they also, of course, could be folded in or performed by a single security point product. By the way, if you traveled to this conference here by airplane, there are actually chances you flown in an airplane where that was assembled in a factory where IFMAP is already in active use. So IFMAP is not some pie-in-the-sky research protocol. It's already something that is in active deployment. So here you see a picture of a Boeing airplane factory in Seattle, Washington. Here's another example of your TNC IFMAP operation. And yeah, I'm just getting the 10-minute. So I'll wrap this up and have discussion. So, but this is another example that shows you how even new standards, right, new protocols that come on could be integrated in a TNC architecture. So the thought here is basically that organizations subscribe to thread feeds, right, that are provided by Stix and Taxi, and then the Taxi agents would effectively use TNC-defined protocols to configure certain TNC components, right, such as automatically extracting watch lists or apply indicator patterns, or automatically configure the PDP. So the PDP can actually reach out to the endpoint and then verify or validate if there's anything on the endpoint that resembles any information that looks like this thread pattern that I just learned via this thread sharing mechanism. So I actually want to break at this and now come to questions and discussions. I have a few more. If you look at the presentations, there are some sources that are provided to you, where you can have a little bit more reading on these various things. So some interesting links. And so as I mentioned, right, this is really all about, so a lot of this, as you probably already kind of gathered, is still kind of, is of course work in process, right? And there's a lot of still research going on here, and a lot of people getting together, trying to come up with solutions. But I think what is really important is that we have broad participation of a lot of people, not only vendors, particularly end users, companies that really should participate in developing standards frameworks, because I think that's really what this is all about. So thank you very much for your attention, and so I'm happy to take questions and have discussions.